This is a video on structures of argument, in particular Rogerian and Toulmin argument. You might be wondering why it's important to understand how other people's arguments work and to understand these different argument types. I think in the same way that if you were building a car, you would take a car that's already been built and then take it apart to see how all of the pieces work together before you attempt to build your own car. Before you write your own argument, it's helpful to understand how other successful arguments are being made. Not just what the writer is arguing, but how the writer is arguing it and what tools they're using, what strategies they're using. Let's start with Rogerian arguments. So these are non-confrontational arguments or debates that were created or invented by psychologist Carl Rogers, although probably throughout history, people have been making these types of arguments. He actually came up with this in his therapy sessions, and the idea was that before you're able to have a real discussion or debate, you have to be able to fairly represent the other person's point of view. So you have to fairly represent that point of view in all its complexity. So of course you want to avoid straw man fallacies or ad hominem fallacies or card stacking. You want to make sure that you are adequately summarizing the other person's position. This might be a paragraph or several paragraphs. These arguments avoid a heated tone, and they focus on mutual benefit. What does everyone have to gain? Even if people have different ideas, how can they come together to create a win-win situation? So I think you can see how this type of argument might be really effective in a workplace where people have to come together with a wide variety of opinions to find solutions that will benefit as many people as possible. Some feminist rhetoricians have coined the term invitational argument to add to this Rogerian approach, which means that you are inviting the reader or the listener of the argument to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. Let's take a look at the 4 parts of Rogerian argument. And of course, some essays will have some of these Rogerian components, but not all of them, right? It's not an exact science. So an introduction in which the writer makes it clear that he or she understands the conflict or the topic or the issue at hand and respects the alternative position. That's really important to have that stance of openness and respect. The context, so describe the situation in which alternative positions are valid. So talk about how your position might not be right in every single case. There might be times where the other point of view is correct. State the writer's position. So you'll see that the writer's own position comes a little bit later typically. Your position or the writer's position and the circumstances in which it's valid. So making some concessions. And then the benefits to the opponent. How can this be a win-win situation? How can people adopt your point of view and have some sort of benefit? The next structure is the Toulmin argument. The philosopher Stephen Toulmin came up with this idea. He said that most people who are making effective or reasonable arguments will make arguments with these 6 components. So anytime someone makes an argument, there is a claim. Of course, to support that claim, there has to be some sort of reason. The claim and the reason put together with the assumption between the two left implicit or unstated. It's actually a term for this that Aristotle coined that's called enthymeme. It's the idea that most reasonable people, when they're making arguments, have a claim and a reason, but they leave part of those assumptions out. If you've studied syllogism before, you've probably heard this famous one: all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so Socrates is mortal. If you left out that middle part, which is kind of obvious or sort of implicit, just all men are mortal, so Socrates is mortal, you left out that middle part about Socrates being a man because it's sort of implicit, that would be an example of an enthymeme. And by the way, with Toulmin argument, this is not airtight, perfect formal syllogism. This is informal logic. So we have the claim and we have the reason, but we also have qualifiers. These are any sort of limits that you place on your claim, which most reasonable people do. Keep in mind that in creative writing, qualifiers are considered less than ideal, right? If you say usually or sometimes or in this certain situation, in creative writing, it can be kind of clunky. But with academic writer, when you're making an argument, it might be helpful to put some limits on your claim, right? In certain situations, this is true, or sometimes, or in this situation, right? To make it really precise. Because rarely can we make these blanket statements and have them always be correct. With the Toulmin argument, we also have warrants. So a warrant is an assumption that supports your claim, and usually that is implicit or not unstated. It is unstated. We also have the backing. So the backing is the evidence not for the reason, but the evidence for the warrant. So the backing is the evidence for the warrant, and the warrant is some sort of assumption about your claim. And then we also have the conditions of rebuttal, where you plant a naysayer, represent what the other point of view or what your opposition might say, and then you might adjust your argument. I think this structure can be really helpful when we're thinking about arguments that we make, whether it's arguments on Facebook or social media or academic arguments or just debates that we have with family members. Oftentimes we're working from a different set of assumptions, and you have to know your audience and you have to know or think about what assumptions they might make. So if you're making a claim about the need for paid paternity leave, it might be important to think about some of the assumptions behind that claim, that reason, and what the warrant would be. For example, some people might believe that men taking more time off isn't really necessary. They might believe that maternity leave or paternity leave is not something that our society needs to value or to compensate people for. So oftentimes we're working with a different set of assumptions. Or when you're writing an argument about the importance of going to college, you might assume that everyone believes that going to college is important, but it might be that not all people believe or assume that going to college is desirable. Let's take a look at some of this in action, because I think when you're just looking at the terms in this sort of theoretical way, it's difficult to understand what they mean. So let's look at an example. Textbook costs prevent some students from going to college, so colleges should adopt free online textbooks for students. Okay, let's break it down. The second part of that sentence, so colleges should adopt free online textbooks for students, that is a claim, right? That's an argument. And the claim has to be something debatable, right? That some reasonable people could disagree with. If it's not debatable, then it's not really a claim. There's no point in arguing it. There's also a reason. According to this writer, why should colleges adopt free online textbooks? Well, the reason is that textbook costs are preventing some students from going to college. So you might think that that speaks for itself, but really it doesn't. There are a lot of unstated assumptions that connect the reason to the claim. That's where the warrant comes in. So the warrant is the connection between the reason or the claim, that assumption, which is often something that tells us about the culture or the society or the time period. So I think there's a couple warrants here, but one of them is the assumption that we want more students to go to college, right? The sentence can rest on that assumption that we want more students to go to college. We need some backing for that. How can we back that more students should go to college? Well, we might bring in statistics or evidence that college graduates tend, not all of them, but tend to have higher salaries and more civic engagement and higher levels of happiness. Again, tend on average on the whole. Backing that supports the warrant that more students should go to college. With the Toulmin model, we also want to use qualifiers, right? We want to avoid blanket statements. We want to be specific, right? So we might want to say most colleges or some colleges or colleges in this situation, maybe community colleges or public colleges or colleges that don't offer textbook scholarships, right? Put some sort of conditions or make some sort of qualifier to add to your argument. Then you want to include the conditions of rebuttal. So if you think about what a reasonable person who disagrees with you might say, they might say, well, wait a second, not all free textbooks are going to be high quality. They might also say we have plenty of scholarships, or most colleges have plenty of scholarships that help students pay for textbooks. So it only strengthens your argument if you think about what the other point of view is going to say, and then maybe you adjust your argument, right? It might be adding to your qualifier a little bit. It might be adding a couple of paragraphs, but you want to adjust your argument in light of thinking about what your opposition has to say.